Kayoshi looks out of the cockpit window. Flying next to him are his kamikaze comrades. Many of them bask in the glory of being able to sacrifice their own lives for their emperor and nation, but Kayoshi doesn't want to be here. He thinks about his mother back home and how he will never see her again. Suddenly, there's an explosion in the sky. The plane next to him explodes into flames and hurtles toward the ocean below. The man flying it was one of his best friends. Kayoshi looks down and can see the flashes of anti-aircraft guns firing from the American fleet. He takes a deep breath and shoves his flight stick forward. His plane speeds toward a battleship as he prays for some kind of divine intervention to save his life. When he opens his eyes, he can just make out the sailors on the deck of the ship diving for cover as his plane hurtles toward them at 260 miles per hour. Then everything goes black. Just over a month ago, Kayoshi woke up on a warm August morning in 1944. He stretched as he got out of bed and walked into the kitchen to pour himself a cup of hot tea. Before going into town to run some errands, his mother made a pot. Kayoshi had just celebrated his 17th birthday and was getting ready to attend his second semester of university in the coming weeks. Most of his friends had volunteered for the army and were deployed around the Pacific to aid Japan in their expansionist efforts and destroy the Allied threat in the area. Kayoshi flipped through the pages of his newspaper on the table. Almost every story was about the ongoing war or interviews with Emperor Hirohito. He explained that it was the duty of every Japanese citizen to help Japan defeat the enemy threat. To the Japanese people, the emperor was the living embodiment of a god, and there was no higher honor than serving him. Kayoshi loved Japan, but his favorite teacher had taught him the importance of critical thinking. He wasn't sure he believed everything the emperor said, but he would never admit that to his mother or to anyone else who blindly followed whatever Hirohito said. Today's paper was full of anti-American propaganda and a call to arms. This had been all that was printed for the last several years, ever since Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor about 3 years ago and dragged the nation into World War II. There had been very little else anyone talked about. The newspaper was filled with national rhetoric and explained how it would only be a matter of time until Japan would be victorious. Kayoshi had seen countless boys from his region head off to war years ago and never return, so it seemed as if victory might be further away than the press was making it out to be. Kayoshi shook his head. What is the world coming to, he thought. Kayoshi sighed and threw the newspapers into the garbage. He took out a heavily read copy of Kokoro by Natsume Soseki, and he began reading it for the 18th time. The story of the young man and his sensei reminded Kayoshi of his own relationship with his favorite professor at the university. He hadn't gotten very far into the first chapter when his mother burst through the front door. "Kayoshi!" she called. He put down his novel and walked to the next room. His mother was holding a white envelope. A look of pride filled her face. "This came for you today. It's from the emperor." Kayoshi's heart sank. There could only be one message sent to him from the emperor. He was going to be forced to join the military. Kayoshi slowly reached out and took the letter from his mother. She smiled at him and placed her hands on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you. You will be following in your father's footsteps by serving the emperor's army." "If Dad were still here, I'm not sure he'd agree with you," replied Kayoshi. His mother's smile turned into a frown. "Your father did his duty for Japan. The war cost him his life, but he died honorably." Kayoshi disagreed, but nodded his head up and down anyway. He looked at the white envelope and opened it. Inside was a piece of paper with a short paragraph about what an honor it would be to serve the emperor. It also explained that he would be joining a new contingent of elite soldiers who would be given a special mission. They would be known as Kamikazes, or the Divine Wind. Below the message, there were 3 options that Kayoshi could choose from. They were to volunteer willingly, to simply volunteer, or to refuse the invitation to serve the emperor. Kayoshi desperately wanted to refuse, but he knew it was not an option. His mother would disown him, the university would expel him, he would be cast out and shunned by his village. Simply volunteering wasn't an option either. He had to willingly volunteer, whether he liked it or not. His loyalty would be questioned. Kayoshi picked up a pen resting on the table and marked an X in the first box. He kissed his beaming mother on the forehead, turned around, and proceeded into his room to pack his bag for the trip to the military recruitment center in the nearby city. When Kayoshi arrived at the military base, he gave his letter to the officer sitting behind the desk. The man looked it over, glanced up at Kayoshi, and reached out his hand. "You're going to serve the emperor and make your country proud," the officer said as he shook Kayoshi's hand. He gave Kayoshi a uniform and instructions to head out to one of the barracks on the base, where he would meet others who had been recruited to be kamikazes. Kayoshi walked to the barracks where the young men like himself were talking to one another in hushed tones. Everyone was waiting for the commanding officer to come in and explain to them exactly what their special mission would be. Kayoshi set his stuff down and kept quiet as the other men chatted. Another cadet named Haisao approached Kayoshi. "This is exciting," said Haisao. We finally get to serve our emperor and aid in the glorious expansion of the Japanese empire." Kaiyoshi just nodded his head. At that moment, the doors burst open. A man dressed in an officer's uniform covered in war medals walked in. "You all have been chosen for a special mission," the general declared. "There's nothing more honorable than sacrificing your life for the emperor. That is why being a kamikaze is one of the most elite positions in the Japanese military. You will be tasked with flying heavily armed aircraft into key targets to destroy them and deal a fatal blow to the enemy." The men in the barracks looked at one another uncertainly. Most knew it was their duty and would do as they were told. Others were less enthusiastic about the thought of being sacrificial weapons used to damage enemy targets. Kaiyoshi couldn't believe what he was hearing. Now more than ever, he wanted to run away, but where would he go? He couldn't return after deserting the military. His mother would disown him. His friends would turn him in. It seemed as if the entire country had gone mad. The general gave the cadets their orders. They would be shipped out to a nearby Japanese Air Force base for training. Kaiyoshi had never been in a plane, let alone flown one. This was his duty, but if he refused, his life would be over. The young Japanese soldiers gathered their belongings and proceeded out of the barracks, where a transport vehicle was waiting for them. "This is exciting," Hisao exclaimed. "The emperor says the kamikaze are the future of Japanese warfare. I heard the great commander Motoharu Okamura's exact words were, 'I firmly believe that the only way to swing the war in our favor is to resort to crash dive attacks with our planes. There's no other way. Provide me with 300 planes and I will turn the tide of the war.'" Kaiyoshi just smiled and kept his mouth shut. He hoped that if he kept his head down and followed orders, the war might end before he or any of the men in his new squadron would be sent to their deaths by power-hungry generals. The group of soldiers hopped on board the idling transport vehicle and left the base. They drove for several hours before an airfield appeared on the horizon. Kaiyoshi lost himself in a daydream of peace. He was brought back to reality when the truck hit an exceptionally large bump, and his head hit the ceiling. He looked out of the vehicle just as it passed through the gates to the airfield. The guards waved to the men on board the transports as they proceeded down the dirt road and toward one of the hangars at the far end of the tarmac. The truck pulled into the hangar and came to a stop. The commanding officer ordered all of the men out of the vehicle. There was someone who wanted to talk to them. Kaiyoshi climbed down from the back of the truck and formed a straight line across the entrance to the massive hangar with the rest of the cadets. They could see a cloud of dust rising at the far end of the base. It got closer and closer until Kaiyoshi could make out the silhouettes of the men riding horses coming toward them. "Stand at attention for your emperor, men," the commander shouted. Everyone stood up as straight as possible. They couldn't believe their eyes. As the dust settled, the kamikaze recruits looked upon Emperor Hirohito of Japan. He rode a brilliantly white horse and was flanked by his generals. "The mission you're about to embark on is one of the utmost importance," the emperor said. "You have been selected to train for one of the most elite units in all of the Japanese military. You will sacrifice your life for country and for me. When you do this, you will be rewarded greatly. You are invincible, and as long as you do your duty, you will make me and your nation proud. Your sacrifice will strike fear into the hearts of the enemy. Follow your commander's orders and remember what you fight for." The men looked wide-eyed at the god king and hung on every one of his words. Kaiyoshi kept his eyes forward but felt a sickening feeling fill his stomach. Until this point, he thought he would be enlisted to aid in the war, but now the emperor was telling him that his sole duty was to sacrifice himself to kill others. Hirohito looked at each one of the kamikaze recruits and nodded his head. Then he rode off. The recruits were put through basic combat training each morning and flight training in the afternoons. Kaiyoshi and the other men would breathe in the fumes of aircraft all day as they prepared for the missions ahead. When he went to bed at night, Kaiyoshi would have nightmares and awake covered in sweat. They always seemed to consist of men screaming and fire consuming his body. The flight training started with the recruits being brought into the skies over Japan by a trained flight instructor who would carry out different maneuvers to ensure that the kamikaze cadets could withstand the motion and the G-forces that were exerted on their body during flight. It would do the emperor no good if his kamikaze pilots passed out while en route to their target. Kaiyoshi looked out of the cockpit window at the landscape below. Japan was a beautiful country, but how long would it stay that way? Eventually the war would reach the shores of the island, and then it would be consumed in fire and death just like the other parts of the Pacific that served as battlefields. After several days of training flights, it was time for the future kamikaze pilots to get behind the stick of the plane. Kaiyoshi watched as one of the other recruits entered the cockpit. The engine roared to life. Each soldier was given a notepad to write their thoughts and improve their skills. The Mitsubishi Kai-51 raced down the runway. Its engine screamed as it approached the necessary speed for liftoff. The wheels left the ground, however only a few moments later the engine stalled and the plane plummeted back to the ground. The impact caused the wings to rip off and the fuel tank to ignite. Kaiyoshi and the other trainees watched in horror as one of their fellow kamikaze pilots was consumed by fire before he even got a chance to reach the battlefield. The aircraft they were training on were older models that had been stripped to the bones. The Japanese military couldn't afford to let these new recruits practice on state-of-the-art aircraft that were needed for the war effort. When they launched their mission to destroy enemy targets, they would also be using older models, except those would be loaded up with explosives. Japanese command thought it was a good idea for the recruits to train and learn the quirks of these older aircraft before heading into battle. This decision would cost the lives of several of their young cadets. The commanding officer returned from the wreckage to inform the other kamikaze recruits that their comrade had been lost. But since he was serving the Emperor, it was still a glorious death. Without giving the soldiers a second to mourn, the CO asked who wanted to go next. Several hands immediately shot up, but far less volunteered than prior to the crash. The training continued for weeks. Kayoshi barely got any sleep. He would think about his mother back home and how proud she looked when he went off to the recruitment center with his letter of acceptance. He thought about his university and how he would never be able to return to it. And then he thought about death. The recruits were trained to suppress their fears and emotions, but Kayoshi couldn't help but dread what was to come. Almost every one of the other kamikaze pilots had accepted their fate, but he wasn't sure he could. He didn't feel that this ultimate sacrifice would make much of a difference in the war, even if everyone else did. After a little over a month, the orders came in. The first kamikaze squadron ever to be deployed was called upon to attack an enemy fleet that was anchored in the Leyte Gulf off the coast of the Philippines. Kayoshi and the other pilots had finished their training, and now it was their duty to deal a defeating blow to the Allied forces. Up to this point in the war, there had been no intentional kamikaze attacks. This one would be calculated and precise. The mission of the men in Kayoshi's unit wasn't to drop bombs or shoot the enemy aircraft out of the sky. It was to fly their airplanes directly into the targeted ships. They wouldn't be coming back from this mission, so their commanding officer had each of them write a letter home to their families. Most of the men told their parents that they loved them and would miss them, but they had been called by a higher power to defend the country and serve their emperor. Kayoshi wrote this to his mother: "Dear Mom, I'm about to be sent on a mission I will not come back from. I know it is my duty to serve the Empire. I will miss you, and the thought of leaving you all alone breaks my heart. I hope the war ends soon, and you and everyone else in our nation can find peace. Your son, Kayoshi." After he finished the letter to his mother, Kayoshi quickly wrote a note to his professor at the university. This letter voiced how he truly felt. "Dear Sensei, the war is about to consume me as it has consumed so many Japanese lives. I can't help but feel that fighting with one another is pointless, and that if we used our words instead of our weapons, the world would be a better place. As Natsume Soseki says in Kokoro, words are not meant to stir the air only. They are capable of moving greater things. Your loyal student, Kayoshi." Kayoshi knew that all the communications would be read, though, and that this letter likely would not make it to his professor due to its anti-war message. But he felt better after writing it. He sealed both letters into separate envelopes and dropped them into the wooden box on the way out of the barracks. The kamikaze pilots were loaded onto a carrier plane and flown to Davao in the Philippines. This would be where their mission would launch from. On October 25, 1944, Kayoshi and the other pilots gathered into the tarmac in Davao to await their final orders. The kamikaze fleet was mostly made up of Mitsubishi Kai-51s, but had a few larger Yokosuka D-4Y planes mixed in. Engineers swarmed the aircraft, making sure that the bombs were secured and the extra explosives would detonate upon impact. Kayoshi couldn't help but think that they looked like worker bees preparing their hive for an invasion. He was pulled from his thoughts as an officer shouted the command for all kamikaze pilots to get to their planes and prepare them for flight. Kayoshi and the rest of the men ran across the tarmac to their assigned aircraft. They climbed into their cockpits and began pre-flight checks. The fuel tanks were filled to capacity so that when the plane slammed into its target, the gasoline would add a little extra power to the explosion. The engineers finished their final preparations and gave the pilots the all-clear. The soldiers, workers, and generals stationed at the airbase saluted the pilots as they took off. They all had immense respect for the sacrifice these men were about to make. Kayoshi looked at the plane to his left, where Hisao sat in the cockpit. They locked eyes. Hisao gave him a stern look and a bow of the head. These men felt very differently about the kamikaze program, but where Kayoshi was forced into it by social pressures and the threat of dishonor to his family, Hisao had been looking forward to this day for a long time. Hisao was most definitely the norm, while Kayoshi was the odd man out in this circumstance. Almost every Japanese citizen would be willing to give their life for their emperor and country. Kayoshi throttled up the engine. The plane lurched forward and then accelerated to top speed. He pulled back on the flight stick and took off. The kamikaze squadron raced toward the Allied warships that had just disengaged the Japanese fleet in the Leyte Gulf. The enemy fleet came into sight. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would go down in history as one of the largest naval battles ever to occur, but it would be what happened in the sky that the world would remember long after the waves of war had settled. The hum of the engine filled the cockpit. Kayoshi looked down at the turquoise-green waters of the Philippine Sea. He thought about making up an excuse to turn around and head back to base. Maybe he could claim his aircraft was experiencing an engine failure and return to get it fixed. When he landed, he would immediately run away and disappear into the jungles of the Philippines before anyone found out he was lying. But Kiyoshi knew that if he was discovered and captured, not only would he be tortured and put to death for desertion, but the dishonor his mother would face would surely break her heart and kill her. Kiyoshi bit down on his tongue so hard it bled. He tried to remain focused on the mission. He told himself this was war, and everyone involved knew exactly what they were signing up for when they joined the military. Suddenly, an explosion brought him out of his thoughts and back to the task at hand. The first kamikaze squadron had reached its target. Kiyoshi watched as smoke filled the sky and his comrades' planes exploded in flames. A crackling voice came over the radio. The lead plane signaled that it was time to strike. The front of the kamikaze squadron began to descend toward the Allied warships below. Kiyoshi took a deep breath and closed his eyes. When he opened them, he had to bank hard to avoid the mangled metal hull of one of the other Japanese planes that had been hit by an enemy shell. He straightened out the flight stick and lined up to his target. Kiyoshi's mission was to slam his plane into the hull of one of the battleships in the middle of the fleet. He watched as the first few planes struck the enemy ships and exploded in fiery infernos. He wondered if the men on board could understand why so many were willing to sacrifice their own lives in service to their own country. Did the Americans think the way the Japanese did? Or could they never understand the blind devotion these men had to their emperor? Kiyoshi looked around him and noticed that his was the only plane that had not dove yet. He thrust the flight stick forward. The plane descended toward the ocean. Kiyoshi continued to dodge the firestorm coming from the Allied fleet. His target got closer and closer. He could now make out the men on board the ship running in a panic as they realized the true purpose of this attack. Kiyoshi focused his sights on the hull of the ship, even though he wanted to pull up and avoid the impact. It was too late now. He closed his eyes and thought about his mother. "Forgive me," Kiyoshi said out loud. Then his plane struck the vessel. It exploded on impact, instantly killing Kiyoshi and dozens of American sailors. The first planned kamikaze attack of World War II had just occurred. Allied sailors who survived couldn't comprehend what had just happened. They desperately tried to put out the flames and rescue anyone who survived the onslaught as ships in the fleet sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Somewhere between 2,800 and 3,800 kamikaze pilots either slammed their planes into Allied targets or were shot out of the sky during the war in the Pacific. It's estimated that Japanese kamikaze planes sunk at least 47 Allied vessels and damaged around 300 others. Over 7,000 Allied sailors and soldiers were killed as a result of kamikaze attacks. At the time, Japan claimed these suicide missions were much more successful than they actually were. Many Japanese military leaders believed that kamikaze missions would turn the tide of the war. They exaggerated the effectiveness of the tactic, which cost thousands of lives and had little effect on the war. Most Japanese citizens would have willingly laid their lives down for the emperor and the country. The masses truly believed Emperor Hirohito was a god and would have fought until the last person if given the choice to either surrender or die. However, like the fictional story of Kiyoshi, there were some kamikaze pilots and Japanese citizens who questioned what they were doing. Some kamikaze pilots survived their missions due to malfunctioning equipment, and later went on to reflect on the messed up nature of the kamikaze program. They realized how they had been manipulated by the emperor and military leaders. Others deliberately deserted the kamikaze fleets and hid until World War II was over. Now watch What If Kamikaze Pilots Survived? Or check out the one reason British Royal Navy ships were invincible in World War II.